Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Nuno Kuta. I am the founder of Optimal Campus Consulting. Just some brief background about Optimal. We have been in operation since 2007, focusing on consulting to higher ed institutions. For several years, we worked only on the IT side of that, doing project management, implementation of large systems, software development, data warehousing, and many other IT areas. But over the past several years, we've expanded to also doing consulting at a higher level, at the university level, in terms of strategy beyond IT. Our approach is really to bring together the smartest, most experienced people from our network of thousands of higher ed professionals and leaders to help solve your problems, whether it's on the technology side or the university strategy side. Or, as in today's session, the university operations side in terms of optimizing those areas. Our webinar today focuses on how to obtain millions and millions of dollars in savings through administrative and operational efficiencies. For that, we've invited Eric Schnurr, one of Optimal's strategic partners. He's the president of Public Works, LLC. He's joining us today, bringing through his company dozens and dozens of efficiency studies for various types of organizations, including states, counties, cities, and of course, universities. Eric has also been an advisor and speechwriter to presidents, governors, senators, and presidential candidates. He also has written quite a number of articles for such renowned organizations as The Atlantic, US News and World Report, and the New York Times. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Eric, who is going to be again talking about how to save you some money. Eric?
All right. Well, thanks, Nuno, and thank you to everybody who's on the call today. I look forward to talking with you. If you've got a question along the way, raise your virtual hand, and Tom will let you in to join the discussion. So as Nuno said, we're going to be talking about the work that my firm, Public Works LLC, has done, sometimes in conjunction with Optimal and working with colleges, but also with all sorts of public entities around the country on how they can save money. This is a good time, I think, to be having a discussion like this. My firm started doing this work around 2003, which will now be 3 recessions ago, when this cartoon appeared in the Washington Post because the National Governors Association meeting came to Washington. And as a result of the recession, states were in such bad shape that they were all looking for money. We started working with governments across the country then to carry out the kind of process that I'm going to talk about today. I think this is going to be a relevant subject in coming months for just about everybody. Most economists are predicting an economic downturn sometime in the next 9 months. I think the elections we just had this week will result in different patterns of federal spending that will impact both state and local governments and what they then spend on higher education and higher education directly. We saw in the 2017 federal tax bill cuts that were targeted and directed specifically at higher education. So I think we may be seeing more of that from the federal government. And if nothing else, the ARPA funds that were designed to help stimulate the economy in the wake of the pandemic will be running out. So on a large number of fronts, higher ed institutions, along with other large entities, are probably looking at significant challenges to their funding bases and to their need for spending over the course of the next year or so. So this is a good time to start thinking about how do you meet those budgetary challenges. And one way to do that is through the kinds of efficiency work that we've been working with all sorts of institutions on doing. This is a smattering of the national attention that our work has gotten. For people in higher education, I might direct your attention specifically to the middle article in Governing about why human services agencies are basically based on a model of the insane asylum that was developed in the late 18th, early 19th century, and now forms the basis for the delivery of most services to large groups of people in our society today. And when I've talked about this in the past, educators invariably jump in and say, well, this includes our school system too. So I'm talking about human services in a very broad sense, from schools and colleges to hospitals to the welfare system to prisons. All of them are based off of a model that is largely outdated and that we know how to do better for a wide variety of reasons today, including the advent of new technologies. So what I'm going to talk about today is what some of the advances in the field of efficiency and performance have been. Now, here's an example of how governments in particular, but I think most large entities, approach the problem of, we've got a threat to our budget. What are we going to do to cut things? This is from a report that was issued by a special committee that the governor of Michigan put together in the wake of the 2003-2004 recession. But this could apply to the approach that we see all over the place. They basically called for a massive tax increase, a revenue increase, obviously, in order to deal with their budget shortfalls. The rationale for it was that the alternative would be large-scale cuts in the budget that would be unendurable, because you would have to cut I did not capitalize these words. These are in the report. We have to cut all of higher ed, basically, or all of mental health, or all healthcare programs, or let all prisoners go, or largely defund the school system. This is how decision makers who work off of budgets look at budget cutting. And that makes sense. If you have a budget in front of you that says this is where we're spending our money, you look at that budget for where you can stop spending your money. We think that that's the wrong approach, and that's what I want to talk about today. This is a cartoon that I like because it illustrates this wrong approach. The lion here is obviously telling the other animals, in light of recent events, I'm afraid I'm going to have to eat some of you. This is actually a takeoff on a much more famous New Yorker cartoon that's so famous that you can't get access to it because of all the copyright limitations. But it basically showed a family sitting around a kitchen table in an economic downturn, and the father is saying to the children, due to the economy, we're going to have to let one of you go. What's amusing about this comment from the standpoint of a consultant is that is in fact how most of our clients approach fiscal challenges, although we all know that no family would approach it that way. You look at your major cost center and say, gee, well, Johnny costs us about $20,000 a year, so he's going to have to go. That's the equivalent of what you saw in the Michigan report about, well, we have fiscal problems, so we're going to have to look for what we can jettison, and you run down the list of things you're spending money on and look for the things that you can cut or get rid of. Well, that's not how a family approaches their budget problems, and that's not how we think that large institutions should approach fiscal issues either. What the family would do, if they're listening to financial advisors like Susie Orman and others who tell families how they can make ends meet, it's not that you tell one of the kids they have to go elsewhere. It's that you start turning off the television when you're not watching it, and turn off the lights in rooms that nobody's in, so you lower your electricity bill by a little bit each month. You start buying your food in bulk at the supermarket instead of impulse buying. You get a high deductible insurance coverage on your car. You do things like that. You save your change whenever you go someplace. If you still pay with cash, when you get the coins back, stick them in a jar. At the end of the year, you'll actually have a couple $100s. Now, a couple $100 isn't going to solve the whole problem, but you do 100 things like that, which is basically what we do in one of these efficiency reviews. And as the saying goes, pretty soon you're talking real money. And more importantly, you haven't gotten rid of anything that you care about. You've in fact gotten rid of things you don't care about as a way of saving money and doing things better. And that's the key to really improving operations and saving money. The approach that we use comes from the Texas Performance Review, which was the granddaddy of all public sector comprehensive efficiency reviews, and is the basis for what's been done in state and local governments across the country since then. And particularly, it was explicitly the model for the National Performance Review, with which you may be more familiar, which Bill Clinton campaigned on when he ran for president in 1992 and instituted and put Vice President Al Gore in charge of. It became famous for things like the golden toilet seat in the Pentagon and the $10,000 hammer. But needless to say, while that plays to the public's image of where waste, fraud, and abuse is, that's not really where money is being wasted or spent in less efficient ways than it could be. The savings really are from operational issues that the Texas Performance Review and the National Performance Review and others like it have identified. One thing worth noting about the Texas Performance Review is it was started in 1991. It's still going on, and it's still finding new ways to make the state government more efficient and to save money in Texas, despite over 30 years of doing so. So virtually every operation, including one that's been undergoing an efficiency review continuously for 30 years, can find additional ways to improve and be more efficient. And that's something that we really advocate. The cartoon on the right is really a good graphic illustration of the approach. And this came from a Texas newspaper at the time of the original Texas Performance Review. And as it shows, you basically take your organization and turn it upside down and shake it and see what falls out. And what's important about this cartoon really encapsulates the ideas very well. You have hopefully large wads of cash falling out, but just as important are the loose change that you find. That, as I said, you put together 100 things like that, and pretty soon you're talking real money. But just as important are those light bulbs. There's two of them in this picture, and if you can see, it says good ideas on them. And these light bulb going off moments and good ideas are an important part of a lot of aspects of how we conduct a review. And I'll give you an example that actually involved light bulbs. This is my favorite finding from the original Texas Performance Review. They set up a call-in line for citizens to call with suggestions. And somebody called and suggested that they do something about the Coke machines that you could find on every floor of every government building everywhere throughout Texas. And this is true in most large operations as well. About 80% of the front display of all of these machines is taken up with a large 3D plastic representation of a Coca-Cola bottle that's basically just there to look cold and juicy and entice you to spend your money. It doesn't perform any other function. And behind this big display of the Coke machine, of the Coke bottle, is a small little light bulb that lights it up and makes it look more appealing. It turns out that if you simply unscrew the light bulb in the Coke machine, it saved hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the electricity usage of thousands of small light bulbs like this in Coke machines on state property across Texas. So that illustrates that lots of small things can help you save money and get to where you want to get to. In Texas's case, it helped them close a multi-billion-dollar budget gap that was so bad that the Texas legislature was considering enacting an income tax for the first time in Texas's history, which was, of course, anathema in Texas. Little things like the light bulbs in the Coke machines, plus larger items about how you handle your larger services better, added up to avert an income tax and close a multi-billion-dollar gap in Texas. But just as importantly, as I'll talk about in a bit, that particular idea about the Coke machines came from a citizen who called in with the idea. So soliciting broad input is an important part of the process. But it starts with a recognition that you're not here just to cut things. We've been told everywhere we've gone that we've already cut everything that there is to cut. And that's probably true if you're looking at your budget. over the years, virtually all institutions have had to look at their budgets, tighten their belts, and figure out what's worth spending money on. The problem is that if it's in your budget, it's probably already being managed pretty well. It's what's not in your budget, which is things like the light bulb behind the Coke bottle, your phone packages, how your trash is collected, a lot of your human resource operations, all sorts of things that are processes or components of other things that you do that aren't in the budget, aren't being managed because they're not in the budget. And that's where you can save money, not with budget cuts. The basic idea is to do better, increase efficiency, eliminate waste, and probably most importantly, improve customer service. The best way to save money is by doing a better job, not by doing a lesser job. And that's what our process is based largely around. I want to give you another example. Here on this slide, it shows that where you might be prompted in a college or university to think about the programs and centers that maybe made sense once upon a time, but don't have as much interest and are costing you a lot of money. That's where you need to look to be saving money. But it's actually the smaller items and the back office items and the processes that go into making every institution run on a daily basis that, as I said, is where you're going to find your money. Now, this graphic here is an infographic that was put together by the labor unions in Chicago when we worked with them. And this is an interesting case in and of itself, in that we were approached by the unions, not by the city government and its management, to help them do a better job and save money, basically in order to save jobs, because they recognized that by working more efficiently, they would actually preserve jobs in the face of economic stresses. And the workers were very much on board in doing that. In this case, I want to talk for just a moment about the recommendation that's illustrated in the upper left-hand slide, and this is one that came from our working directly with the city's workers, the stakeholders, and looking for ideas. This particular item involves the pouring of concrete for the city's sidewalks. Turns out that concrete takes about 5 hours to cure, to pour it, set it, do what you got to do to make the sidewalk into a sidewalk. From start to finish, it's about a 5-hour process. So that meant in an average 8-hour day, they'd work for 5 hours pouring a segment of sidewalk, and then they couldn't get started on doing anything further because there were only 3 hours left in the workday. The workers recommended to us and to the city that they change to a 4-day a week, 10-hour a day work schedule, same 40 hours, but spread over 4 days instead of 5 days. The result would be that they could pour 2 5-hour segments of concrete each day, or 8 per week, which would give you 8 segments instead of 5 segments per week, which is a 60% increase in your output for exactly the same amount of work hours for the same budgetary cost. And on top of that, the workers liked it. They liked the idea of working the 2 extra hours a day in order to have a 3-day weekend every week. So this was something that made the workforce happy and was more efficient, provided better service to the citizens of Chicago, and saved the city money in terms of the increased efficiency and use of its resources. And again, this came from the workforce itself, which is an important part in putting together any kind of really functional efficiency review. My point here is that lots of things that you don't think about in your operations, or where you can go to save money before you start thinking about what major academic center that may be a hallmark of the university has to be shut down because you don't have money anymore, or what layoffs do you have to impose because you're looking at fiscal constraints. So what you want to do is think through every aspect of operations and look for the small things, not just the big things, for how you can save money. So how do you do that? This slide mentions a couple of steps that we utilize in our overall process, but I always tell people there are 3 main components to how we do this kind of work, and you can more or less describe it as us, you, and them. The us is we have a team of consultants who obviously have done a lot of these things and who come out of the kinds of institutions that we're looking at. So they come in with a certain base of knowledge of where to look for, typical kinds of things to find, and that's useful. But on top of that, every institution, every government, every college and university has their own unique kind of quirks. For instance, in Colorado, we found that the state had 3 different inter-office mail delivery services. 2 were basically state government functions, and 1 was a private contractor that they had outsourced to. And you could literally stand in the middle of the state office complex where the state capitol was and watch 3 different mail trucks from 3 different services following themselves around in a circle to all of the office buildings. We obviously recommended that they just reduce to 1 service, and it saved them money. But not everybody has that particular problem, but everybody has some inefficiency like that they're doing. And the thing is to identify those. And part of that comes from the them part of this equation, which is knowing what's going on elsewhere and what sort of problems have been solved, what best practices are in similar institutions or jurisdictions all around the country. But the foundation for all of this is an understanding of the institution itself. And that doesn't just come from the top. That has to be a widespread process of stakeholder engagement. And that's very, very important to how we do our work. And it should be central to any kind of efficiency analysis and review for a couple of reasons. One is that ultimately a report is only going to sit on a shelf, and any kind of analysis or directive coming out of the administration is only going to get as far as the administration building if the rest of the employees throughout the institution aren't bought into doing what the report recommends. So we go to great lengths to include people because being asked your opinion and being included is without doubt the best way to make people feel like they're a part of the process and that they will accept the recommendations that come out of the process. So widespread stakeholder engagement from top to bottom is very, very important. From what I've seen of college campuses at something of a remove these days, both in terms of working with colleges as a consultant and also as an adjunct instructor, I think you're seeing something similar in the private sector as well. The youngest generation now expects to have much more of a say in how anything that they're a part of is run. And I think that's particularly true on college campuses, and not including students in this kind of process would be a grave mistake. But to overlook as well all of your personnel, from the buildings and grounds to the office assistants and everybody else involved, they need to be included because A, they need to be brought into the process, or the results of the process really won't get implemented. And secondly, they've got lots of ideas. In government, at least, my general theory, which I'm yet to see disproved, is that virtually every public employee goes to work every day with a thought in their mind that their boss doesn't know what he or she is doing, and that if you only asked me, I could tell you how to run this place better. But nobody's ever asked them, and they've been more or less given up after 10 years on the job and keep doing things the way that they're done. But if you ask people, you learn about things like the 3 mail delivery services that are circling each other. You can learn about the light bulb and the Coke machine, all sorts of things, big and small. FedEx saved millions and millions of dollars because it listened to one of their truck drivers who had, from several years of experience, figured out the best way to pack a truck so that you got the maximum number of boxes into the back of it, which obviously cuts down on the number of trips and the number of drivers needed. They became much more efficient and saved lots of money by listening to the employee lowest down in the organizational chart. So including everybody is an important part of the process. And we do that from individual interviews, both with higher ups and with line staff, but also with focus groups at all levels of the organization. And we also employ an electronic survey process that normally gets between 40 and 60% of participants responding. And any of you who've done any work around survey research will know that that's a very high response. People are dying to tell how their organization can function better, and asking them is an important part of the process. The final step on this slide that I talk about here is fiscal analysis, which is obviously important if what your interest is saving money. Although, as I said, our point is to make things function better so that you can save money, not to focus on the money, but at some point you want to do a fiscal analysis. And one important part of that is to think about this in multiple years for a couple of reasons. One is that in lots of cases, being more efficient and saving money involves making investments up front. Sometimes that's in assets, particularly IT, which can save you a lot of money downstream. But also it's sometimes hiring people or shifting people into positions where they're going to be more productive. So it doesn't necessarily involve cuts in staffing, but oftentimes can involve hiring people who are going to help with improving operations in ways that will save money downstream. So looking at your year one savings is really not a good measure of whether you're improving your operations, saving money in the long term, and really becoming a more efficient organization. The other thing is that focusing on the immediate year savings tends to result in a lot of budgetary gimmicks that can hurt you in the long term. The most extreme example of this is, I used to joke about this, but the state of Arizona actually then went ahead and sold the Capitol building because it wanted an infusion of cash. Sale lease agreement of the state capitol may look good for a year, but the next year you have the budget hole still left to fill and you don't own your state capitol building anymore. So looking at multi-year projections for what your savings are going to be and what your costs are going to be is the only way really to be efficient about looking for efficiencies. I want to mention for a moment, I've dwelt mostly obviously on government operations because that's what we've done the bulk of. But we've worked with higher ed institutions and we've worked with the folks at Optimal on higher ed institutions as well. And there are particular issues that affect, any kind of operation has its own particular substantive area that you need to focus on, although most of this is operational. But obviously there are specific things in the higher ed context. I want to focus for a minute on the bottom items on the slide, which I think are becoming important everywhere, but particularly in the higher ed context. Technology is a game changer in every way, and it's not just bringing in a computer to do tasks that previously weren't done by computers. It's changing everything about the world around us and how we structure all social institutions. And that increasingly means higher ed as well. There've been a lot of complaints and a lot of things that we've learned about the problems with distance learning and online education during the pandemic, largely because we knew before the pandemic that going to a wholly online system is not a productive way to provide education. The technology can supplement human beings, but we also need human beings to supplement the technology. So what you ultimately need to make the innovations in technology and education work is to have a blended approach. And institutions are moving more and more in that direction, and they will more and more have to do that. But this isn't just an educational issue, it's also a budgetary issue as well. The last large-scale review that we did was for a large county. The county also operated a community college, and we devoted a chapter specifically to the community college and how it could improve its operations. And we looked particularly at these new kinds of technological innovations. And that can affect operations and the budget on both the spending side and on the revenue side. There's a lot of ways to attract new revenue sources, new kinds of customers, if you will, to the non-traditional learners who are more and more making up the base for post-secondary education in this country. Different kinds of customers that can be brought into the educational system through access to technology and distance learning and new types of courses oriented towards those populations. So you can use the technology to attract new revenue sources and new customer base. It can also be used to reduce costs. There will be less of a need for brick and mortar facilities in the future, obviously, which is a big cost for campuses. But it will also change the composition of your faculties in various ways that can lead to lower aggregate salaries over time. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done and that will need to be done because of the technological changes we're seeing. I mentioned that as in all industries, we're going to see a decrease in demand for physical facilities in higher education over the next several decades. I mentioned several of those here that we're already seeing becoming concerns for administrators around the country. Dorms, labs, event spaces that are use less. Instead of regarding those as white elephants, those can become innovative spaces for involving the community with the campus, which can redound to both the students and the institution in all sorts of ways, can also become revenue sources by using them for non-student and non-faculty uses that they haven't been before, so that instead of being cost centers to the college or university, they can become revenue generators. So the basic thing is to think creatively about everything that you've got, from your light bulbs up to your largest capital assets, and all of the processes that you operate in between in order to get to your savings. My last slide here is about getting everyone on board, which is related to a couple of things I mentioned earlier. Having everybody on board is important to actually implement the savings. I think a lot of people's reactions are, this isn't going to happen because there's too much pushback from people, whether it's in the administration or whether it's line staff who think that any kind of look at efficiency means trying to find ways to fire them. We often encounter a situation where people are afraid to move forward with any kind of look at efficiency because it's just going to involve too much pushback. There was a instance we had in Arkansas, as you can see from this masthead here, where we were brought in to do a review of an agency in a very hostile situation. The legislature wanted the review. The agency did not. We were hired by the legislature. The agency head and his top staff really had their backs up about our coming in, and it started as one of the frostiest meetings I think that I've ever had. By the end of the process, however, we got along quite well because the process worked, and the agency head and I testified before the Arkansas legislature jointly, where the agency head embraced our recommendations. And in fact, the agency then hired us to continue working with them because they liked the results of the process so much. In fact, what the agency head testified to the legislature, and these were his verbatim words. But you can't tell my wife that I'm using this slide. She always objects to this. But this was the actual quote in legislative testimony from the Secretary of the Arkansas Department of Health, which basically goes to illustrate that lots of people can think this is not in their interests when you're getting started. But if you do it right, if you involve people, if you make them feel that they're being listened to, it's amazing what you can find about how to improve virtually every operation. And if you do that, you don't have to cut the things that people care about. I guess that's my presentation, and we'll open it up to questions.
Hey, Eric, just a quick question. This is Nuno. Because we've worked together, I know a little bit more about how you operate, and I've been incredibly impressed by the types of consultants you bring in and the level of their experience. Can you talk a little bit to that? These are not junior people with their recently minted MBAs.
No, well, that's that's our operating model, as you know, and it's not the operating model of most big consulting firms, especially when it comes to public sector entities that they're not getting as much money as they're getting from the Fortune 100, so they tend to deploy their younger staff to learn on the job on those. We've got a completely different attitude about that, and in part it's because of the efficiency work. That's not all that we do, but I think it's important, specifically important when it comes to efficiency, because as I said, and as anybody would know, you start talking about budget cuts, efficiency, anything like that, people are going to get their backs up. They think what that means is you're bringing in a consultant to take a hatchet to me or my friends and destroy our operation and that sort of thing. And it's very important that people not feel that way. And part of that is two components of the people that I hire, beyond, of course, the people at Optimal who all fit these descriptions as well. But it's important to me to have people who really know the operations and entities that they're dealing with. If we're looking at a health department, say, we will utilize people who are who have run health departments and who have worked in various levels in the health department, so they really know things. Because it's really amazing how far people will go to help you if they feel they're being heard, and making sure that everybody in the organization feels that their voice is being heard. As I've said a couple of times in this, it's essential to coming up with the best ideas, with knowing everything down to how the boxes are being put in the truck. But it's also essential to the downstream implementation. And people feel they're being heard, both if you listen, if you set up processes that make it clear that you're listening, but also if when they're talking, they realize they're talking to people who understand their concerns, who understand their problems. And having people who know higher ed institutions, like the folks at Optimal, which is why we utilize Optimal when we're working in the higher ed context, is essential to making people know that they're talking to somebody who gets where they're coming from and understands their problems on a nitty-gritty daily operational level. The other thing I insist on in who I hire is that I actually have to like them. My former chief operating officer used to blanch when I said this, because she was a very green eye shade kind of person. She thought this was too touchy-feely. But there's two reasons why I only hire people that I like. One is I've got to work with them, and I would prefer to work with people that I like. But the second thing is the likability of our staff goes just as much as their credentials and their experience to making sure that people think this isn't just another consultant who's in there, wasting their time, blowing them off, getting a check to tell them things that they already know. The classic description of the consultant who is hired to tell you what time it is and ask if he can borrow your watch. Well, that's not our approach. But to get past that stereotype of consultants, I think you need to have people that the consultees can relate to. And so, we bring in people who I think are good people in every sense of that description, but in part are selected for this task specifically because they ran agencies. They were agency heads. They were chief of staff to the governor. They were assistant to the president of a university or a high-ranking dean. That's who our people tend to be.
Thanks, Eric. Very impressive. I think I see Elmore has his hand raised.
Yeah, am I off mute?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Eric, I wonder if you could take a real quick pass at describing the process from start to finish. How do you come into an organization? What do you do sort of first, second, third? How long does this analysis take?
Well, I'll start with the last question. You should be able to complete a comprehensive review like this in 6 months. We've had some that have dragged on for longer, largely because of the client, and we've had clients who have thought that it should take a lot longer. But you could really do this if you're doing it efficiently, which of course is the goal of an efficiency review, in about 6 months from start to finish. We did have one instance where we had a 6-month plan. The state was slow in processing the contract, so by the time we got started, we had a little less than 5 months to finish it in order to get it done to meet the state budget deadline. And about halfway through, the governor decided that he'd like to release the results a month earlier. So we were halfway into it and suddenly told that we needed to wrap up in about a month and do the whole six months in about 3.5 months. We did it. can't say it was fun, but our goal is to meet the client demand and fit into their timeline. In terms of timelines, generally, I think that this is a good time to start thinking about this sort of thing. Almost all public institutions in this country are on a July to July or July to June fiscal year. Academic institutions obviously tend to work on a midsummer to midsummer sort of cycle as well. So given that it takes about 6 months to do this, getting started at the beginning of a year so that you can be implementing everything in the new budget year is generally a good thing to do. And as I also mentioned, I think given developments in the outside world with the economy, the coming political shakeup in Washington, the running out of the existing federal funds in a lot of areas, now would be a good time to be thinking about this before fiscal crises start hitting. So anyway, that's a general timeline issue. In terms of the process, I've described the main elements already. I think I can go back to that slide here. Maybe not. But anyway, I guess it is that one. Yeah, there we go. I mean, the first thing obviously is the kickoff and handling that properly, and we put a lot of stress on that in terms of getting people acquainted with each other, making sure that everybody understands the process, describing what we're going to want by way of document requests and information discovery and that sort of thing, and then having solid communication throughout. The second step in that is the documents and secondary research. A concern that clients frequently have is how disruptive of this organization are you going to be? You're going to be like rifling through our files and pulling everybody out of work to basically do the consulting for you. The answer is no. We want existing data. So to the extent that there are useful reports that you have, obviously auditor reports, there are existing budgets. Every now and then there are studies that have been done, whether by outside consultants or internal think tanks of various aspects of operations. All of the things that already exist are useful to us in learning about the institution, learning about the government, figuring out what it is that we need to know about them in particular, so that we can then have useful conversations with all the individuals involved. And so the first step is doing data collection, but we never ask for the client to be creating data for us. We'll do the research we need to do on that. And nowadays, virtually everything that's ever been produced is available online. So there's very little disruption in getting this information. Very frequently, it's just a matter of being pointed to the right place on the website. Otherwise, most information is produced electronically these days. So it's a pretty non-disruptive process. But that kind of research is the first step. The next step would be all of the stakeholder engagement that we talked about. We usually start with interviews at the highest levels of the organization, talking to individuals to get the big picture. Then we start drilling down. We tend to do those in focus groups. We find you can have a good discussion of somewhere between 8 and 15 people. We'll talk to people in each department. This can be academic departments, it can be students, but we're also interested in talking to the people who work on the food service line, or the people who work in buildings and grounds. The one item that we recommended that got the greatest reaction ever from anybody was that we found that they'd never properly calibrated the salt spreaders on the snow plows in West Virginia, and that if they simply put the right amount of salt on the road, they would save $3 million a year. That was in a total operating budget for the state that was $2 billion. So $3 million was not an insignificant saving for something like salt spreading. But I talked a minute ago with Nuno about the fact that we bring in people who have expertise. Do we have people who have expertise on salt spreaders? No, that's a little too granular. But you have people who are experts on salt spreaders, and we need to be talking with them and finding out how every piece of equipment can be operated better, and what is it that they know, because invariably they do know how to do things better. The salt spreader idea came out of a fairly lengthy brainstorming session with employees in the highway department that raised a number of other issues. So this kind of focus group conversation is very, very important. And then, of course, the surveys are important as well. By far the number one item when you ask members of the workforce what can be done to improve operations is pay us more money. But about 10% of the answers are something other than that. And those can be really, really useful and really instructive. The Colorado example of the mail trucks that I gave you came out of a survey response. So we really try to do intensive work with everybody at all levels of the organization. At that point, we'll do best practice research. If something has come up that is novel, which is usually the case, like say the salt spreaders. I mean, that was one that you could do by, actually running the salt spreaders and seeing what their output was and figuring out what the savings would be based on that. But in other cases, a problem will be identified that there isn't a readily apparent answer to. And so you need to look around. Has anybody else encountered a similar sort of issue, and how has that been addressed? And where it has been addressed, what has that meant in terms of actual savings, so that we can then make a kind of rough calculation from that to the institution or entity in question as to what that would translate into savings for them. At that point, we start working these up into preliminary recommendations and ideas that could turn into recommendations and preliminary financial projections of what these might mean. And we then go over them with the client, with the people who are in charge of our project. And this is the toll gate process that's referred to on this slide. The toll gate is a term that came out of the Texas Performance Review, and we still use that. The toll gate, I think the terminology arose originally because the idea was that every recommendation, every suggestion had to stop at the toll gate and either was allowed to proceed or not. And it's really not so much proceeding or not as a three-way triage process. There are ideas that come up that when we present them to the administration, are obvious right away that this is something that should be done. It's simple. It's not going to produce any kind of pushback. It will save money. Why didn't we think of this? Let's go ahead and do this. So there's a lot of things that come up immediately that get a green light, so to speak. And there are things that get an immediate red light. The most interesting ones are the ones that are in the yellow light lane, in that they are potentially good ideas, but maybe something like that was tried a couple of years ago and it didn't work. But rather than rejecting it, the question is, why didn't it work? And a lot of times it's because of personal or personnel issues that have evolved over time and can be addressed differently now. In some cases, obviously, there's technological change that can be addressed differently. But the interesting things are where it might be a good idea, but we're not sure, there might be a problem. And so that requires further thought to be creative and further research to find how it might have been addressed elsewhere. So after this initial toll gate, which we try to do roughly 2 months into the process, or about a third of the way through, we'll go back and do further research. And on the things that have gotten the green light, we're filling in the details and firming up the fiscal projections. For the things that are in the further development category, we do the kinds of further research that I described, and try to work them up into something that is workable and that will pass the toll gate the second time around. I've talked some in this about the fiscal analysis, and I've mentioned that we try to work up the savings projections on things. We try to do it for multi-year. We also try to be conservative about this. Just, we don't think it does the client any good for us to issue a report saying, here's how you can save tremendous amounts of money that are actually never going to materialize, and you're left explaining to your stakeholders why you didn't achieve the savings that the consultants said you could achieve. And that's another purpose for the toll gates, to be interacting with the administration, with the people who are going to have to live with these decisions and implement them, to make sure that these are recommendations that they see as feasible and that they can buy into. And so we particularly work closely with the budget people and the fiscal folks on your campus or in your government to make sure that where we're having to do, particularly projections that are based off of something intangible, that we're going to change an operation and in some place else it's saved X%, and this is or isn't comparable to your operation, and so we are doing kind of what our guesstimates of what are the savings going to be. We want those to be things that the fiscal people can look at and say that is sufficiently believable and sufficiently conservative for us that we can accept that as a real savings that we can build into our budget. And our recommendations have been audited post hoc twice by state governments that in both cases found that the savings were higher than what we said they were going to be. And that's because we're very cautious about this and we want to work directly with the budget people to come up with firm savings that you can count on. And then, this all goes back for a final toll gate, which, at this point, most of the things are pretty well baked in as to what are the processes to undergo, what are the savings that you can expect from it. There might be a couple of things where there's a little bit of controversy where that needs to be talked through, and the ultimate client decision maker has to decide whether they want this to be included or not. And that's essentially the end of the process there. And we try to do that about 2/3 of the way through, or in other words, at about the 4-month mark. At that point, you as the client and anybody that you're reporting to about this, whether it's the public or the board of overseers or whatever, can be pretty well fully informed on what the overall magnitude of the efficiencies are and what the components of that will consist of. The remaining time is basically used for turning all of this into a finished written report. And we work very hard at the report. Obviously, that takes up the final third of the time that I've allotted, because ultimately it's a sales document of sorts. All of your stakeholders, all of your constituencies have to buy into the plan that's being put forward. So we make sure that this is readable and digestible, and that people will want to and do consume the results of the report, so that everybody in the organization and all of your stakeholders understand this is what's going to be done. This is what everybody's bought into. This is how it's going to get done. This is the time frame in which it's going to get done. And this is what the results are going to be. So we work very hard at perfecting that report down to the last dot on the I and cross on the T. And we do that interactively with the client. And then ultimately, that's the end of the project. We do sometimes stick around or get asked to stick around to help with implementation. But, if asked, yes, we can help with implementation. But really, if the process is done correctly, you need very little by way of implementation, because everybody who's going to do the work has been involved to that point, and people have signed off on it. Everybody who needs to sign off on it, including the people who are, actually going to adjust the salt spreaders. Everybody has been a part of this process. They know it can be done. They're committed to getting it done. And a properly done review process basically implements itself. The plan tells how it's going to be done, and the organization does it. You really shouldn't need consultants sticking around to help you. Will we do that? Yes. But really, the idea should be to have the process done properly so that the recommendations are self-implementing. And that's basically where we get to in 99% of the cases. That's our process.
I'm noticing that we're getting close to the hour. I did think I saw Michael have a question. Do we have a couple of minutes for your question? Michael, are you still there?
I'm still here. Eric. Eric, this isn't so much a question, just as a comment. Your Colorado mail delivery story, I appreciated very much, not just because I live in Colorado and I appreciate your saving money for the state, but because it reminded me of what I often have seen in colleges and universities, that they're incredibly siloed organizations, and things get duplicated because everybody has to have their own X. And whether that's on the academic side or the administrative side, you see that happening. I would imagine that may well be why you had 3 mail delivery systems in Colorado government. But it's certainly clear that happens time and time again in universities, and there are savings to be had if you identify those and get rid of them.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Silos are the enemies of efficiency, and there are lots of functions that cut across these silos, and they tend not to get looked at when people are thinking about how do we cut our budget and how do we improve things. There's an RFP out now for an efficiency review that a local government has requested, and I think they're missing the point in a lot of ways, in that they've actually asked for a look at their back office functions, HR and procurement and that sort of thing. But they clearly think that, they're fairly small operations, and so there's not going to be much in savings because they don't have many employees. They've got $1 million budget for HR, so they've got roughly 8 to 10 people who are handling it. And there's only so much you can cut, so there's not going to be much by way of savings. Well, there are huge savings to be had in HR. There are even huger savings to be had in procurement that go beyond simply what's the $1 million budget of the office for the people who are doing that, because every entity of that government and every entity of a college or university they're making purchases, and the systems you have set up to make those purchases and to regulate how everybody else is making the purchases are huge points of friction where dollars are being lost because of inefficient processes. And improving everything about them. Instances where decisions can be made dispersed and locally, so to speak, as opposed to centralized, and the decisions that should be made centralized. Getting that balance right is an important issue in how much you're spending on your ultimate spend, as well as how much you're spending on what you think you're budgeting for the spending process, the personnel involved, and that sort of thing. Every aspect of operations is a place where you and everybody else are undoubtedly spending money that you don't need to be spending, and you can tighten things up. But the lack of communication between silos, which leads to duplication, which leads to inefficiency, is just a huge sieve of money going out your door. And the thing is, because those interconnections that don't exist aren't part of the budget, they're not being managed, they're not being paid attention to, they're not known, and that's where the money's being wasted.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're approaching the end of the hour. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Eric, for taking the time to talk to us about this topic. You're obviously an expert and have done this many times before. If anyone would like to dig deeper into this conversation, into this topic with Eric separately, we're happy to set up some time. You see the email, his as well as mine, on the slides. Eric's approach, as you can tell, is very robust. It's taken years to develop, test, and implement, so take advantage of an opportunity to talk to what I certainly consider one of the most foremost experts on this topic. We'd like to invite you to our next webinar and our final webinar in this series of webinars, which is happening next Thursday at the same time, noon Eastern time. And that webinar will be focused on, this time, IT and how to use IT to innovate operations, innovate delivery of services at an institution, at a university, and to differentiate it from its peers in this competition. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again. Take care.